Pax Romana may have thrived, but at least part of its prosperity was borne on the backs of millions, and not just of soldiers or citizens, but through a system of human bondage unlike anything the world had seen before. In this episode, I want to delve into a darker side of Roman society and the so-called prosperity of the Pax Romana. We'll look at the institution of Roman slavery. How did it function? From the brutal realities of capture and sale to the potential, although limited, paths to freedom for slaves. As we'll see pretty early, slavery for the Romans was not really about economics. Why then did the Romans insist on having such a large portion of their society enslaved? We'll talk about it on this episode of the Pax Romana podcast. Episode 43, Ancient Roman Slavery. Something that we see over and over again in Roman culture is an obsession with identifying and differentiating the boundaries between different groups of people in the Roman world. Roman slavery was very much embedded in this aspect of Roman culture. Slavery was more about the social order than anything else, including economics and race. That's not to say that the Romans did not think about the economics and even the racial aspects of slavery, but just that these ideas were subordinate to broader notions about social status and defining people into neat categories. For the whole of Roman imperial history, slavery itself was not questioned. It was as fundamental to the Roman experience as something like war and conquest. And indeed, there are some that believe that slavery in the Roman world had its origins in war. The word for slaves, servus, is quite similar to the word servatus. Servatus is one who is spared or one who is saved. This goes back to fundamental ideas about war. When the Romans conquered an enemy city, everyone in that city was at the mercy of the conqueror. And so anyone who was spared was in effect saved from death by their captors, who justly could have massacred the entire population. Those people should have been dead, but instead they've been saved. And so this new status of being spared from death made them something in between alive and dead. They were in a kind of purgatory. They weren't dead like a thing without life, but neither were they fully human because they owed their life so thoroughly to their conquerors. And so we see slaves being treated in Roman sources almost like animals in some ways. When I teach my university students about Roman slavery, I like to begin with a quotation from the Greek physician Galen, who lived in the Roman Empire in the middle of the 2nd century AD. It's a fascinating comment. This is the story that he tells. Quote, "When I was a young man, I imposed upon myself an injunction which I've observed throughout my whole life, namely, never to strike any slave of my household with my hand. My father practiced this same restraint. Many were the friends he reproved when they had bruised a tendon while striking their slaves in the teeth. They could have waited a little while, he said, and used a rod or whip to inflict as many blows as they wished, and to accomplish the act with reflection. Other men, however, not only strike with their fists, but kick and gouge out the eyes and stab with a stylus when they happen to have one in their hands. I saw a man in his anger strike a slave in the eye with a reed pen." That's the Greek physician Galen. What is he saying? He's saying you should be careful when you strike your slave, not because the slave is a full human being that feels pain and should be respected as human, but because you might hurt yourself. He goes on describing human attributes in the slaves: teeth, eyes, real human bodies. And yet these are just things to injure yourself on. And so that's why you shouldn't strike your slave. You should be a more temperate person. And when you beat your slave, you should do it while not in a state of uncontrolled anger. good behavior towards slaves says more about the slave owner than it does about the dignity and humanity about slaves. And so what we see in Roman sources is the assumption that slavery is perfectly natural. The Romans can't imagine life without slaves. So as they write about farming, about manufacturing, about mining, sometimes the slaves aren't even mentioned. They're just there in the invisible spaces between the words, silent machines that plant crops and water them and pick them and make the pottery that ships them. Because Romans just take slaves for granted, they don't really count them, and we have no idea how many slaves existed in the Roman Empire at any given time. We don't know the percentage of the population that were enslaved. There's a passing reference in one of Galen's works where he says that 1/3 of his home city of Pergamum in Asia Minor were slaves. But of course, where did he get that number from? We don't really know. We do have a lot of inscriptions to slaves or which celebrate the freeing of slaves. Most of these are from urban environments rather than agricultural environments. They're personal servants to dignitaries. We know that soldiers had slaves and sometimes honored them. Scholars have attempted to count up these inscriptions about slaves. And what it looks like is that there's a peak under the first emperor Augustus, and then a fairly steady decline from his reign down through the centuries. And it kind of looks like maybe slavery declined, but of course, all inscriptions in stone generally follow that same pattern. Where we don't find much evidence of slaves is probably the place where they were most abundant, and that's out in the fields. We don't have really any rural inscriptions for slaves. At best, we can look at the foundations of rural structures and perhaps identify slave quarters. Archaeologists sometimes know they've hit on a place where slaves stayed because they find iron rings or chains there. Otherwise, slaves were essentially invisible. By the time the Pax Romana began, slavery was tremendously important. Rome had been expanding for several centuries prior and had accumulated slaves through war and conquest like gangbusters. Sometimes Romans would brag about how many slaves they would capture in a given battle or after a given war, and the numbers were always high. Tens of thousands, some cases more than 100,000. Vast amounts of people were forcibly uprooted during the late Republic and transplanted to Italy and into the city of Rome. We know that slaves were especially prominent in villas. And these were not just vacation houses, but large estates. And slaves could be employed in an almost assembly line style labor in the villa. Some slaves became very good at making amphorae, the jugs that transport wine and other goods, or bricks, for example. Maybe there's a group of slaves that constantly kept the kilns going, a group that prepared the clay, then a group that transported the pots back and forth, a group that made deliveries. Agricultural slavery was probably brutal, with slaves working every day of the week and, of course, long hours out in the sun. These slaves were mostly unskilled and were therefore cheap and quite replaceable. And so they could be worked so hard that they probably died within a decade or so. However, there were still worse fates for Roman slaves. You really did not want to end up in the mines. The Roman state would lease mines to procurators who would contract the work out. Villages of criminals and slaves would form around mines. You'd even get a few free laborers finding themselves so desperate that they needed to sign contracts to work there. Miners found themselves in dark, sooty pits for most of the day, cramped, diseased, malnourished, with bowed backs and broken skin. Now, despite such harsh working conditions for Roman slaves, especially those that worked in agriculture and in the mines, the general thrust of the literary record suggests that slaves may have had slightly improved conditions over the course of the Pax Romana, with a series of imperial edicts gradually easing abuses of slaves. The Emperor Claudius, for example, declared that a master could not arbitrarily kill slaves on a whim, nor could he execute slaves simply because they were sick. Vespasian passed a law that prohibited slaves being sold directly into prostitution. Domitian banned the castration of slaves just for the purpose of selling them. And Hadrian even extended slaves the right to a trial if the master wished to kill them for some reason. Finally, by the reign of Antoninus Pius, whom we'll meet in a few episodes, murdering a slave could, in some cases, carry a charge of homicide. So the Pax Romana was pretty good to slaves, all things considered. In the Roman Empire, slaves were bought and sold sub hasta, that is, under the spear. It's an old term that went back to the idea of slaves being justly acquired in war. A slave was a conquered foreigner. We have a few epitaphs of freed slaves which actually show what the process of buying and selling might have looked like. Slaves were exposed naked on a platform with a placard indicating things like nationality or their age or any special skills or education. And then from there, buyers would mercilessly inspect slaves, making them perform physical tests to show agility or cleanliness, strength for manual labor, for example. Of course, if slaves were desired for sexual purposes, their beauty was checked. They were checked for diseases. In the end, slaves who had skills and education, or who were perhaps former artisans, would fetch the highest prices. By contrast to the slavery of African peoples in the Atlantic world, Roman slavery was relatively open. That is, probably about 10% of the slave population could expect to become freed at one point in time. Romans had a well-established manumission process, which, if we think of the logic of slavery, a slave was captured in war, they no longer have their old identity. When a slave is freed, therefore, it's almost like they're being reborn. They take on a new name, usually the name of the master that has freed them, and they're given full status as a Roman citizen, as though they've just been born as a Roman citizen. Their old heritage, who they were before they were a slave, is officially gone. No father, no mother, no birthday, no nation. They are now Romans. There were plenty of ways that a slave could obtain freedom. It was customary for slave owners to free a percentage of their slaves when they died, just as a sign of beneficence and kindness. Magistrates and even emperors could declare slaves free by fiat if they wished. A slave himself or herself could earn freedom by means of purchase. Slaves were actually allowed to do side jobs and to save money, and eventually pay the price that their master had set for their own life. It was a good system for the master too, because it would take a few decades or so for a slave to save up enough money to buy their own freedom, and when they did, they were usually older, weaker, less beautiful, and less useful to the master, and then the master could then take the money and buy a brand new slave. It worked out pretty good, and of course this system kept slaves in line. It was an incentive for them to remain loyal to their masters despite being in the status of a slave. So Roman slavery was a multifaceted institution deeply woven into the fabric of their society. The exact number of slaves remains a mystery, but their presence undeniably shaped Roman society and the Roman economy as well. Slaves were more than just property, but neither were they fully human. And we see brutality in the system, especially in the mines and in the fields. But the legal reforms that survive in our sources suggest that at least some Romans saw a contradiction between their view of themselves as a force of civilization on the one hand, and yet the treatment of slaves as little more than animals on the other. And in the Roman system of slavery, there were opportunities to earn freedom, although with a social stigma that endured for generations. One thing, by the way, that slaves nor freed slaves could do was join the Roman military. And you would think that during the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, that maybe the Romans didn't need much of a military, but you would be wrong. The legions continued to push the boundaries of the empire through the reign of Trajan, and as the Pax Romana began to wind down and incursions in the north and in the east of the Roman Empire started to become more regular, suddenly Rome had tremendous demand for soldiers. And so on the next episode of the Pax Romana podcast, we'll talk about Rome's legions. How were soldiers organized? What sorts of careers did they have? And what was it like to spend decades in the Roman military? We'll talk about it in the next episode of the Pax Romana podcast.
Thanks for listening to the Pax Romana podcast. For more information, including a list of primary sources and further reading, check the show notes. Music by Red Productions and Exocor. Follow Dr. Colin Elliott on X at ProfCPE or email colin@paxromanapodcast.com. Listen to more episodes on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or just about anywhere podcasts are available. Stay tuned for the next episode of the Pax Romana podcast.